Dr. Barclay Shephard. I was born in Boothbay Harbor in 1926. But when I was 1 year old, the family moved to Istanbul. And the reason we moved to Istanbul was that the American and English-speaking community in Istanbul wanted to have an American hospital in Istanbul. And so my father was in, when he went to Aintab, my mother and father, they were with the Congregational Church Mission Board. So that they were supposed to go to Iran for their next mission station, but the people in Istanbul wanted very much to have him start an American hospital. You know, he grew born and grew up in Turkey. He spoke the language very well, knew the culture. All of that made him a perfect candidate to establish this hospital in Istanbul. So he went to Istanbul in 1927. The whole family went to Istanbul, 1927. And then he started the American Hospital of Istanbul. Now, at that time, there was a German hospital in Istanbul before the war, and it was managed by some nuns, American nuns, German nuns, but because the Germans lost the war, this is World War I I'm talking about, they left. So the hospital building in Istanbul, which used to be the German hospital, was vacant. And so my father said, well, we'll start this hospital in the old German hospital building, and then we may move to another building later on. So I was too young to remember any of that. I was only a year old. So, but they eventually moved into an apartment. That is the hospital. My father started the hospital in an apartment building in Machka, not far from Nişantaşı. And so that's where the hospital was for many years. But, you know, that was the best they could do. But the building was an apartment house building, not designed as a hospital. So my father's strong wish was to design and build a new building. The family came back to for a year to America, and during that time, my father went all over the country, this country, to raise money to build this new hospital building, and he raised over $1 million. Then we went back to Istanbul, and he started building. He designed the building, and they started the construction also in Nişantaşı. Güzel Bahçe Sokak. When the family was back in America in 34, 35, Dad, in addition to raising money for the new hospital building, also spent some time with a famous doctor in New York. Bellevue Hospital was a big public hospital in New York. And my father's and one of the leading surgeons in that hospital was a man by the name of Alan O. Whipple. Dr. Whipple is famous for having developed a surgical procedure to treat cancer of the pancreas. So that is known as the Whipple procedure, and it's a removal of the head of the pancreas where the cancer is. And my father worked with Whipple on developing that operation. And so when he went back to Istanbul, he performed the first Whipple procedure in Turkey, and the man survived. So he was, he became one of the members of the Turkish Cancer Society. So he made a big. In fact, I've heard that when Ataturk was dying, the doctors who had been taking care of him asked my father to consult with them to see if there was anything that could be done, but it was too late by that time. So we lived in Nişantaşı. We also lived in Bebek, and I went to school on the Robert College campus because there was a community school that was set up to be a school for the families of for children of the families of the faculty at Robert College, and also the business community. And you know that there was a big American tobacco company had some people in Turkey managing the importation of tobacco in the eastern part of Turkey. In Hatay, there was a special kind of tobacco that was grown, and so there were some American business people there, and then, of course, there were all the diplomatic people. There was a consulate in Istanbul, and children of the consulate also went to this school. So it was an interesting school, and we learned a lot. And we had a French teacher, Madame Robin, who lived in Bebek, and she was our French teacher. So I learned to speak French fairly early in life. So fast forward to 1938, when I was 12 years old. I left Istanbul and came to America, and went to school at a little school in Exeter, New Hampshire, called the Emerson School. 4 years there, and then I went to Deerfield Academy for 2 years, and during that time, the war in Europe started, and so I went to Deerfield. And then, after graduating from Deerfield in 1944, as I say, the war was on, and I had the desire to be an officer in the U.S. Navy. So one way to get a commission was to go to the Maine Maritime Academy, which would be the equivalent of Yüksek Denizcilik Okulu in Maine. Yeah. So I went there from 1944 to 1946, graduated, and the war was over before I graduated. So I didn't want to go into the Navy if there was nothing to do in the Navy. So I decided to go into the Merchant Marine. See, the maritime academies train people to become officers in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Maritime Service, and a license to be an officer on a ship. So I got all of those from the Maritime Academy, and I decided to go to sea in the Merchant Marine. So I got a job on a freighter. The American export lines, had ships going into the Mediterranean. And so I got a job on what we called a victory ship at that time. and worked for almost a whole year and traveled a lot in different places. It was great. We went to the Mediterranean, and then we went through the Suez Canal to India and also to Russia. So that was that year. And then I went to Bowdoin College. I entered Bowdoin College and graduated in 1950. So I majored in French and minored in history. I grew up in Istanbul, so I lived as a child. All my early memories are of growing up in Istanbul, in Bebek, and Robert College campus and all. Wonderful, wonderful childhood, just great. And of course, the Rumeli Hisar is such a beautiful place overlooking the Bosphorus. And also, anyway, so that was great. So after I graduated from Bowdoin, I didn't really know what to do, but I decided I want to go back to Turkey because my parents, my mother and father, had spent most of the war years in Turkey, in Istanbul. Dad, was managing the hospital, so he decided he wanted to. So I hadn't seen most of, my parents during the war. So I decided I'd like to go back to Turkey and spend some time with my parents, which I did. I got a job at Robert College teaching English. So from I got to get these dates straight, from 1950 to 1953, I was a teacher at the Orta School, what we call the Robert Academy, which was the prep for Robert College. So I taught English there for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, I decided I didn't want to be a teacher anymore. I really wanted to become a doctor because I had spent time with my off hours. I would go down to the hospital and go around the hospital with my father when he was making rounds and so forth. So I became more and more interested in the idea of becoming a doctor. In the meantime, I forgot to mention, I was married my second year at Robert College. I came home and married a lady I had met in college during my college time. And so she came back with me to Istanbul, and my oldest son was born at the American hospital in Istanbul. And he was delivered by his grandfather. And as I say, it was a good thing he was a boy, because in those days, when a boy is born, they say, Mashallah, Allah bağışlasın. But if it's a girl, they say, Geçmiş olsun. And we named him Douglas. So my oldest son is in 1953. He was born January 1953. And so we left Istanbul. And it was interesting because in May of 1953, do you know why that's an important date? Of the conquest of Istanbul. 500 years. And all the minarets were lighted up. It was beautiful. And then we came back to the United States, and I had to prepare for medical school. I majored in French and minored in history. That's not a very good preparation for medical school, not enough. So I had to spend a year and a half. I'd never taken a course in chemistry before. So I went to Harvard summer school, and took a whole year of inorganic chemistry in 6 weeks. That was very difficult for me. But I passed, and then I had to go to get more pre-med courses. So I had to get organic chemistry, physics, and so forth. So I went to Boston University and got those other courses. And then I applied to the 3 medical schools that were in Boston: Harvard, Boston University, and Tufts. And Tufts accepted me. So I was 4 years studying at Tufts University Medical School. And then when I graduated from the Maritime Academy, I had this commission in the Navy. But that was what we call a line commission, an ordinary commission. So I converted that to a medical commission. And in those days, the U.S. Navy and the other military forces granted what they called the scholarship program. So I went on active duty my last year in medical school. By that time, I had 2 more boys, twins. They were born my first year in medical school. So I had 3 boys, 3 sons, still in diapers in my time at medical school. And that was so demanding of time and so forth. Anyway, so I started my Navy career my last year in medical school, and then they ordered me to go to Bethesda Naval Hospital to do my I knew I wanted to be a surgeon like my father and like his father. So I started my training as a surgeon at the Tufts Medical, we call the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. I was there for 5 years, and then they sent me to a hospital in Beaufort, South Carolina, where I was a surgeon for 2 years. And then I really wanted to be a chest surgeon, a thoracic surgeon, because my last year at Bethesda, I was very interested in being on the thoracic surgery service at Bethesda. As a matter of fact, I scrubbed, when I say scrub, I assisted at the first open heart operation that was ever done at Bethesda Naval Hospital. That was very exciting back in those days. So they sent me to a hospital in New York, which was St. Albans Naval Hospital, to do my chest surgery training, which I did 2 years. The Vietnam War was going on at that time, and I decided that it might be a good idea to get some combat casualty training or experience, not training, experience. So I volunteered to go to Vietnam for a year, October to October of 1967, 1968. And I went aboard the hospital ship, the Repose. There were 2 hospital ships in Vietnam at the time. And they sent me to the Repose, where I served for 1 year. I even did an open heart operation on the hospital ship. They sent me a patient who had a congenital problem in his heart, and so I fixed that with open heart surgery. We had the equipment to do that on the ship. That was kind of exciting. So then they sent me back to St. Albans after a year in Vietnam, and I was a chief of thoracic surgeon there. And then that program closed, and I went back to Bethesda, where I was the assistant chief of surgery. Assistant chief of thoracic surgery. And then I decided to retire from the Navy. That was in 1979. So I didn't know quite what I was going to do, they called me back. They called me in to work at the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration headquarters were in downtown D.C. on Vermont Avenue, if you ever knew where that was, in Washington, right across from the White House. So I did that, and I was working. I didn't do any hospital work, but I did administrative work. I don't know if you remember or knew about the Agent Orange problem. Now, Agent Orange was a chemical that was used in Vietnam to kill the leaves of the trees that were used by the Viet Cong to hide and launch surprise attacks. And it was a very deadly operation. Excuse me. So the military decided to use this defoliant, and it was a defoliant that's been used for years and years and years in this country, and so, but there was a growing suspicion or a thought that the exposure to this chemical, or combination of chemicals, two chemicals, that exposure to that caused all kinds of different problems. So it became a very hot political issue about the Agent Orange issue and the military and so forth. So we did, the head of the medical department at the VA in Central Office of VA was a good friend of mine. He had been my boss on several occasions. He had been in the Navy, and he actually had been the Surgeon General of the Navy. So then he went into work for the VA after he retired from the Navy, and he called me into his office, and he said, "Barclay, I want you to do some research to see what this Agent Orange problem is all." It was quite new about the Agent Orange problem. And I said, "Don," his name was Don Custis, wonderful, wonderful person. I said, "Don, you know I'm a surgeon. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know how to do that kind of research." He said, "Oh, you figure it out. You'll do it." We're a team, and we did a lot of research. And I won't go into all the details about, but we found out that there was a risk of developing two diseases. One was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and one was soft tissue sarcoma. These are two relatively rare diseases, but it looked like that might have been an outcome of exposure to this. But to do the research, we didn't have, we had no idea how much any of the veterans or any of the troops there, they were mostly Marine Corps, we didn't know how many of those were exposed or to how much they were exposed and so forth. So it was very difficult. We had to make a lot of assumptions. We assumed that everybody who served in that area might have been exposed. So we did several studies, and it turned out that we thought that these two conditions might have been the result of exposure, the soft tissue sarcoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So we proposed that the VA proposed that the Congress connect these, and so they be service-connected conditions, and therefore veterans who develop these conditions would have lifetime benefits from the VA. So that went on, and then finally I left that job after 7 years. I was up testifying before Congress a number of times. I was transferred to a different department still in the VA, and was tasked to develop a program which would convert, we say, analog images, for example, X-rays, bronchoscopies, looking down at people's lungs, cardiac catheterizations, looking at the coronary arteries, convert those from a normal image into a digital image. So I recruited a couple of people and we went to work and developed that. The Veterans Administration was responsible for a lot of the early work converting paper medical records into computerized systems. And this became part of that. So that was very exciting. So I did that for 4 years and then decided to retire. And so I came back to my home in Boothbay Harbor, and that's where I am today. And let me go back a little bit and tell you an interesting story. When my father was practicing in Istanbul, there were 4, including my father, there were 4 American doctors. You may know this. 4 American doctors working in Turkey. My father, Dr. Bill Newt in Talas. We had an American school in Talas. Dr. Haas had a clinic in Adana. And Dr. Dewey was in Aintab. So these 4 American doctors, Ataturk had put out a firman saying he didn't want any American doctor. He didn't want any foreign doctors, not just American. He didn't want any foreign doctors practicing in Turkey. The Turks, Turkey is for the Turks, the famous saying. Refik Saydam was Ataturk's Minister of Health. He knew my father and he knew about these other doctors. So he went to Ataturk and he said, we have these 4 American doctors who are doing wonderful work in Turkey. Not only are they improving the medical practices, but they're also training doctors. So we need them in this transition time, so early with the Republic. And Ataturk said, okay. So there is a firman signed by Ataturk naming these 4 doctors and giving them permission to practice. But they could only be there as başhekims of hospitals, and they could not have a private practice. In other words, they couldn't go out and they had to work as başhekims in these hospitals or clinics. So interesting story there. There was a lady who came from a very wealthy American family, and she was married to the vice president of Robert College. My father knew about her, of course. Everybody did. She was a wonderful person. Elizabeth Huntington Clark. No, Elizabeth Huntington. And her parents were very well. Her father was part of a corporation, was the head of a corporation that had huge mining operations in South America. So Dodge, her last name was, her maiden name was Dodge. Elizabeth Dodge Huntington. Huntington was the vice president of Robert College, and they were married. Anyway, but she was a very modest, very humble person. Nobody would think she came from a wealthy family. Anyway, so he had been in Gaziantep, but there were not. He sort of left a vacuum in terms of really well-trained surgeons there and other doctors. So he decided that he would like to sponsor 6 men from Gaziantep to come to Istanbul, go to Robert College, get a good basic education, go to the medical school, Hacettepe, or not Hacettepe. That's another interesting story. But University of Istanbul Medical School, and get trained in modern techniques and so forth. Well, and he didn't have the money to do that, of course. So he went to Elizabeth Huntington and said, "Would you be willing to sponsor 6 men to come from Gaziantep to Istanbul to be trained?" And she said yes. So he selected. He knew, families and so forth in Antep, and he'd been there. So he selected 6 men who agreed to come to Istanbul, providing, come to Istanbul and get trained, providing they agreed to go back to Gaziantep to practice medicine, surgery. So one of those men was Cemil Özbal. Cemil Özbal, and he had another friend, and they came to Istanbul, and Dad took a special interest in Cemil Özbal because he seemed to be a candidate for really becoming a good surgeon. So he and his friend, while they were at Robert College, met 2 young ladies who were working in the strawberry fields up in what is now the upper part in back of Robert College, up on the hill. They were these 2 girls. So these 2 guys from Gaziantep fell in love with these 2 girls, and Cemil Bey came to my mother and said, "We've met these 2 girls, and we'd like to marry, but they're just peasant girls, and we can't. We'd like to have them trained or educated, so when they come to Gaziantep, they will be educated women," and so forth. So Mother agreed to help the girl that he was interested in. Seher was her name. And so he sent Seher to ACI. No, not ACA, to Üsküdar, the American school in Üsküdar, Valabaş. And she would come and be a babysitter at ours. I was still quite young, so she was my babysitter. And the Özbal family and the Shepard family have been close friends for many years. When I was teaching at Robert College, one of my students was Orhan Özbal from Gaziantep. And he later became a surgeon in Izmir. And I guess he's still living. His specialty was breast cancer. And he became the leading breast cancer surgeon in Izmir. Well, I claim that my father was responsible for founding Gaziantep University, and this is how it worked. When my father was an undergraduate at Yale, that's where he did his undergraduate studies, pre-med studies, he met a classmate. In fact, they may have been roommates, and it was Dr. Newt, William Newt, who came from Kansas, I think, the city. Yeah. And they became close friends, very close friends. And my father told Bill Newt, he said, why don't you join me? You go to medical school, and then we'll go back to Turkey, and you can practice in Turkey, and I'll practice in Istanbul. He said, well, if I'm going to go to Turkey, I better find out what living in Turkey is all about. So he got a job as a teacher in the American Board School in Talas. and he loved it. He thought it was wonderful. So meantime, my father started his training at Columbia University Medical School in New York. And so they stayed in touch, and Bill said, "Okay, I like Turkey. I'll come and join you in medical school, and we can go from there." And my father was pleased with that. So, meantime, my father graduated from Columbia and went back to Gaziantep. Bill Newt finished medical school 2 years later and went to Talas, where he met the lady who became his wife. They were married, and he had a son, Bill Newt Jr. Bill Newt Jr. also became interested in the idea of becoming a doctor and a missionary. So he came to the United States, or he went to medical school. I don't know where he went. I forget where he went to medical school. Anyway, he got his doctorate degree in medical school, from medical school here in the States, and decided he wanted to be a pediatrician, a pediatric surgeon. So he went to a hospital for special training in America, and there he met his son Doramaji. His son Doramaji had come to the United States to train as a pediatric surgeon. So they met in both taking their residency. And of course, Bill Newt was fluent in Turkish, having grown up there. And so he met Doramaji, and they became good friends, because Doramaji didn't expect to find somebody who was proficient in Turkish. So they became very good friends, and they decided that there weren't enough medical schools in Turkey. So they decided that they would start a medical school in Ankara. So they started the Hacettepe. Hacettepe University was started as a medical school and then became a full-blown university. So I say that my father was responsible for establishing Hacettepe University Medical School. It was the first time I'd ever had the responsibility of being a Barclay Shephard in a hospital. And I made good friends. They were wonderful doctors and so forth. I loved the food. It was a very 6 years as a Barclay Shephard there was a wonderful experience. Sizi çok özledim. İnşallah hepiniz iyidir.